to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. And though I'm not a big fan of self-promotion, I was listening to the podcast of today's guest earlier, and they did a very adroit form of of asking for some help, which is required for us in podcast land. And so if you dig the show, please consider rating it on iTunes, which remains the main way that most people listen to these things. And also know that the archive of the show is available on prn.fm, as well as my own technosis.com website, which is linked to a lot of other articles and talks that I've given. So now that we're done with that, we can move on. Our guest today is Marc Kate, who I first met when he interviewed me for another podcast that he does called Why We Listen, which was it's a fascinating exploration in people's tastes and what moves them and why they pick out certain tracks when asked by podcasters to do so, and trying to figure out, it's a fascinating exploration of music and meaning. And he's also an electronic musician, makes some very, very beautiful, you have to call it ambient music, but it's got an edge that he adds both in terms of the sound quality and the sort of spirit of the operation, and he kind of works in sort of a almost an anti-new age ambient zone that can also sound like quite peaceful and sublime music. So it's part of that aesthetic that he's exploring in a more overt way with his latest recording, which came out in September, called Deface. And for this striking act of ambient politics, Marc went through and spent an undoubtedly somewhat gruesome period of time listening hard and long to National Socialist black metal, i.e. fascist Nazi black metal, and extracting from this music of hate, this aesthetics of hate and intransigent sovereignty, musical material that then he morphs and mutates in a plunderphonic fashion into these glacially gorgeous ambient drones of mourning and loss that appear on his record Deface. We'll be hearing a track from that a little bit later. The sort of brilliance of this move alone inspired me to get him onto the podcast. But in addition to that, he has his own podcast called Scary Thoughts, which he does with a partner in crime whose name is eluding me at the moment. And it's about horror, and I've been thinking more and more about horror of late. So I thought it's perfect timing to bring Marc on the show. So Marc, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to hear what it was like to do this sort of research work on Deface. I mean, I know, just from previous conversations that you've spent a lot of time listening to metal in a wide range of the subgenres, but also for a number of different reasons, including your own interest in nihilism, in horror, in aesthetics of timbre, of sound worlds. You had a lot of reasons to listen to that. And what kind of led you to this ingenious transformation of some of the world's most hateful music?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about doing that research, spending all that time researching this music and listening to it, is that, of course, it's all just one Google search away, right? It's not like I was going to dark libraries and dusting off old aging scrolls to get this information. It's all right there. As are a lot of really horrifying things about the world at this point. They're all right there at our fingertips. The difference, of course, is to actually spend a lot of time immersed in them. I think that what really got it started for me was thinking about alt-right meme, the meme wars, these strategies that used to sort of belong to the left have been appropriated by the extreme right, and it has been really, I don't know, frazzling so many people on the left to have these techniques, these aesthetic strategies turned against them. When I think it just in music, you brought up plunderphonics. That was a way of sort of undermining the music industry, for example. And those techniques are now being used to sort of like undermine social justice causes, right? And so I was thinking about how to use those sort of strategies in a more traditional sense, in line with like John Oswald, Bob Ostertag, artists who recontextualize music. I was also thinking about the chopped and screwed movements. I don't know, like Steve Reich's "It's Gonna Rain" or John Hartfeld's, political photo collages. There's a lot of history behind how I came to make this piece in the first place.
Well, but it's interesting to the part of what you were responding to is a need, is a questioning on among many people on the left who, and from the earlier versions of counterculture, this kind of shock at how rapidly and strongly and quite frankly sometimes quite creatively and ingeniously the alt-right have appropriated these tools, which were generally associated with the left, with anarchism, with movements based on kind of a great negative towards the status quo. And since they, in a way, have their own version of that negative, it kind of makes sense. But it happened with such speed and with such intensity, and it was because it was able to be distributed through the internet and take advantage of the internet's own kind of meme ecology in a way that these previous movements, which tended to be coming at earlier phases, more analog phases of cultural politics, didn't even have quite that availability. And so it's almost like, what do we do? I mean, like, how do you respond to that? So it seems to me that one way of looking at Deface is as an experimental approach to deterring the détournement, to flip it on its head yet again, but in a different way with a different emotional register.
Exactly. I mean, although this is to a degree political work, it's not as activist, let's say, as what's happening, shall we say, on the street, or even in meme culture, really. I'm just sort of mirroring a tradition of approaching content that's been going on for a long time. And it's not even so much that like, oh, the extreme right stole these strategies from us. I think there's a little bit of that. What's more important is we've lost our ability to play these strategies somehow. We people on, I'll just say the left, or people who are not on the extreme right, have sort of lost a sense of humor, a sense of play, a sense of freedom to recontextualize and destroy, because we're so wrapped up in being careful and being precious. And that's why this art battle is so lopsided, right?
It's true. No, that's a very good point. I mean, it wouldn't be as unbalanced as it is if there weren't some real problems on the left that this kind of approach is playing off of, and including this kind of sense of preciousness and perfection, and a kind of carefulness and a kind of hesitancy, a sort of especially from if you're on the more anarchist side of the left, some of it is just very kind of aggressively sort of conservative in a weird sense. So there's a kind of conservatism in a lot of positions, in the way in which they get articulated, in the way in which they are distributed, the way in which they're discussed, the way in which they're held. I can't put my finger on why it happened, but this kind of seriousness became more and more the mainstream of a lot of progressive positions.
Yes.
And in a way, it was kind of like the side, the flank was exposed. It's like the Achilles heel grew larger and larger and easier to hit with more and more sophomoric targets or approaches would be able to worm their way in. And so are you seeing, along with to look at Deface as part of a process of talking back to that situation, but do you see other things that are happening that people are doing? Do you see some ways in which the balance, the imbalance is being addressed these days?
I'm not. And not in some way of saying that I'm the only one doing this. I'm just not especially seeing it. It still does seem particularly one-sided that, even in this conversation, regardless of what topics we're going to hit in the next 50 minutes, you and I are probably the type of people who are going to be fairly careful about how we phrase things, lest we make some sort of political transgressions, either against our own ideas or against ideas with which we align ourselves. And that is so very, very different from the Kekistan nihilist, throw everything at the wall and don't care what sticks, just as long as it's dismantling, right? And I think that's the core of how very lopsided this is. And
it's true. It's true. Yeah. It's really interesting. I've been wrestling a lot of it, having done some of my recent research on Discordianism and the kind of anarchist prankster current within the 60s counterculture, which could appear both in leftist guises and then more anarchist utopian prankster guises. But going back and looking at it with contemporary eyes, it's so clear the way that so many of these gestures are now alive on the right in a way that they're not in the left, and just seeing how that evolved and devolved and shifted and changed it. It's really kind of a remarkable story about how discourse is organized, how affect is organized, how we take care, how we make gestures of taking care. It's a very complicated issue, and you decided to do it with a certain affective transformation, in a way like you could say, oh yeah, he took Nazi black metal tracks and mutated the music. Isn't that subversive? Isn't that fun, or whatever? But you took them in a certain direction, which is, your music is like a lot of ambient music, but in particular, even compared to a lot of stuff that I listen to and enjoy, has a very powerful affective dimension to it. You're definitely playing with the connection between texture and timbre and emotion, and particularly longing, mourning, a sort of glacial awe. There's these very powerful kinds of emotional charges in there. And I don't know whether you think about your music this way, because it's often the case that listeners think about music much differently than the composers. But it does seem that like part of the alchemy you were doing in transforming this hateful lead was to bring it into a certain emotional register. And I'm wondering what that was about.
Yeah, well, actually, that's exactly how I think about it. I feel like we are in mourning. We've lost a lot. And I'm using we not as some sort of like leftist gesture, but we, like this country, our people, this planet, we're losing. There's this loss. It's not even necessarily a political statement to say so. We are losing ground. We are losing our gains. This sort of collective project that we are, one would hope, all embarked on, is losing ground, or at least our idea of that we're all in this together is one of loss. And that sort of dovetails with a lot of work that I've been doing outside of this project in particular, which is really examining nihilism and believing and seeing that we are globally in an incredibly nihilist stage in human history, right? Whether we're talking about the burn it all down Donald Trump voting or extreme Islamic terrorists, suicide bombers, or it just, these things are all just sort of like, or like The Walking Dead, apocalypse narratives. This is all sort of, we can better view, and it's that capitalist realism Zizek thing of like, we can more easily see the end of the world than we can see an end to capitalism, right? There are these struggles that we can't even conceive of being over. And so we just want to start from scratch somehow.
Yeah. Since you brought that up, I wanted to talk about nihilism. It's something that's a theme in your conversations and in your music, and it relates to this, issue. How have you come to think about working with it? Because it's like, on the one hand, clearly nihilism is ascendant, and there's many good reasons for it. If we actually need reasons, or just thinking about the environment alone and what kind of calamities are coming down the pike, and our incapacity to even begin to really deal with it. And the sense of loss that is attendant with the loss of species and the kind of dominant, just in that zone alone, let alone leaving aside many of the other domains of it. There's like, you have good reason for despair, or one has good reason to give up hope. And so on the one hand, there are good reasons for this, and even more so, it's clearly a flame. It's burning through cultures and technologies and media. It's like nihilism is everywhere if you tune into it. But at the same time, to kind of really confront nihilism, really engage it, really recognize it, really bringing yourself into dialogue in it, doesn't just mean to give into at least some aspects of nihilism. So there's still a kind of wrestling with it that I hear you trying to work with.
Yes.
How does that work? And maybe even how does Deface kind of show one way of approaching or playing with these issues?
Yeah, I think that I've approached these ideas around nihilism and this album Deface very similarly, where I'm considering something that needs resistance from, and in investigating it, in researching it, and seeing what I can extract from it, and create some sort of opposition. I am deeply freaked out by the degree of nihilism I see in the world, and my way of reacting to it is to research it, learn as much about nihilism as I can, not just on a surface burn it all down way, but actually reading books by like Ligotti and Lovecraft and Chiron and writers who have really gone the distance with nihilism, and similarly with National Socialist black metal. So who are these people that are so deeply invested in creating? Black metal is already a genre that is immersed in hate. The darkest aspect of satanic practices, the most cancerous end of occult studies. And so where do we go when we look to the extreme of that extreme, which are these, Nazi, anti-Semitic artists that are creating music that are overtly or covertly celebrating just the worst aspects of humanity. And what can I do with that? And so creating something beautiful, and again, dolorous, because I think there is a sense of loss. I wanted to create something that was beautiful, but also something that is almost like a requiem. I didn't want to be too hokey about it and take all this National Socialist black metal and then create this like sparkling early 80s meditation new age, but rather express not its opposite, but what I'm genuinely feeling in reaction to it.
Yeah, in a way, that's a more challenging but more profound kind of alchemy, because to simply ironize or to simply subvert at this point is really to participate in the culture of cheap nihilism that in some ways you're reacting against. And so there's a vulnerability that's required of just being like, these are like real feelings and I'm feeling them for real reasons. And these reasons are not just my personal story. It has to do with where we are and an honest look at the engagement with the situation. And it comes out of a real feeling, but also what you also mentioned, and this is something it's really been in my head a lot, of how to wrestle with the nihilism that I feel with when I encounter it in the world, when I'm encountering the reasons for that nihilism, whether they're cultural reasons or specific, concrete factual situations, is that spirit of curiosity, investigation, and research is really, really, really important. There's a magic and a ballast in just trying to understand. And I've spent a lot of the time, like you, and part of the reason I was interested in your project is just, over the last year and a half, and having already spent a lot of time interested in certain right-wing phenomena and definitely black metal stuff, and I was already tuned into some of the ways that countercultural music has been appropriated for sort of nationalist causes and whatever, but more recently really trying to understand what's going on, like really trying to understand where people are coming from, at the very least, so that I am no longer surprised. And the mark of it's not, I'm no longer surprised because I'm dulled to whatever the gestures that the right makes or the degree of hatefulness or nastiness that you see online or whatever. It's not about getting inured to it. It's being able to actually understand it well enough that you can kind of almost appreciate it, not in the positive sense of lionizing it, but appreciating like, I sense, I can get where that's coming from, even if I completely reject it. And that mind frame seems to me very rare these days, and very for my mind is absolutely required, because otherwise I just feel lost.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to bring up the echo chamber effect that so many of us are lost in due to social media, I feel very strongly this impulse to do to go the opposite way, to not only flee Facebook, but also to immerse myself in what is scaring me the most about the world, rather than just have my own viewpoint and positions reaffirmed on a daily basis, have them challenged, and I'm sort of going into these texts of nihilism and the extreme right, not as something purely to deturn or to alter, but to understand. And that is, I say this ironically, it's almost like I want to do something heroic with that gesture. Take a hero's journey into the, this dark abyss, and be able to come back with something useful, right? All that, but I don't want to frame it that way too elaborately, because really I'm just sitting around reading books and making and making pretty music, right?
Yeah, but it's still, there is something epic about it. I mean, I've gone on a similar path. I mean, I take pessimism philosophically very seriously. I always have. I've almost by nature I don't go there, but not out of a strong sense of conviction in opposed to a lot of pessimist positions. I find a lot of them extremely persuasive. And I've had the opportunity of knowing people who really inhabit that world, people like Eugene Thacker, well enough to get a sense of what it's like to really like walk the talk. And at the same time, it's just not my story. It's not what comes up for me. Although the older I get and the more I think in my own terms, the more I realize that those issues are completely enmeshed with whatever the more positive or hopeful or loving or religious or whatever aspects of myself that are also operative. That it's more and more clear to me that to be alive and awake and hopeful and still connecting with people and still in love with reality or nature or whatever, that to do that adequately these days, it's almost like you have to also have a relationship with the pit or the abyss or what, I mean, that you can't get one without the other. It's totally false. And so there is something, I think, big about these gestures, especially at a time when it's so easy to either go into distraction and, smoke weed and watch Netflix, which of course you do anyway, but
sounds so good. Yeah.
Or the filter bubbles where you're around a lot of people who are righteous and agree with you, and you feel the power of that connection, and we've got another, this is our idea, yay, whatever. When there's a win or something, and that's another kind of it's like a sports kind of approach to political subjectivity, and that doesn't really do it for me either. So I think there is something to be said for diving into some of these difficult waters and trying to figure stuff out. So here's a concrete question: what did you figure out? What did you learn about Nazi black metal, National Socialist black metal, after having gone through this research period and selecting tracks and trying to drill down into what the affect is and then how to transform that, watching your own reactions? What was that journey like for you as a listener, as somebody who likes metal as a genre, as someone who's invested in these political issues?
I feel like I came away with a lot. I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting is that in this conversation about nihilism and looking at these issues through a lens of nihilism, I think that truly National Socialist black metal is in a way not nihilist. It is people who are often, not all of these artists, but actively articulating their vision of a better world. It's a horrible world, but there is that sort of vision somewhere in it. And I think that's why there is this conservative politic in it, is trying to figure out where the issues are, with anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia and all these things, and sort of generate what their vision of the best world is. But another thing that I think is really interesting is, while that's true, earlier we were talking about call-out culture and being very precious about words and being careful how you signal your own politics. A lot of National Socialist black metal is not necessarily trademark stamped as such, right? There are some bands that are overtly so, but then there's an awful lot of what would the expression be, dog whistle blowing. There's a lot of lyrics that just sort of hint at the Third Reich or Aryan history or something like that, and secret affiliations that a band member has. So there's this very elaborate matrix where there's not National Socialist black metal and other kinds of metal. It's more that so-and-so was part of this band when they were this old, and now they're in this band. Does that transfer some sort of toxicity to this new project where that's a racist band too that we have to object to? But what's also, I think, interesting is the roots of almost all of black metal they're pretty terrible. They're pretty rotted. So it's really easy to maybe just dismiss the whole thing, right? The whole genre is pretty poison, but it's fascinating poison. And I think for me as a listener, and I'm not a metal guy. I grew up on post-punk and new wave and synthesizer music, and my interest in metal came far later. So there's a bit of a poser. There's a bit of a tourism in this for me. But I'm really fascinated by black metal, but it's really hard to listen to sometimes. To be specific, I don't know. Maybe most listeners wouldn't know the artist Burzum, but it's a solo project, and he went to prison for murder. He's an overt Nazi. He just made a role-playing game about the Fourth Reich or something like that. He's a deplorable human being, but his first couple of albums are, sorry, they're masterpieces. And it's really hard to listen to, and it's really hard to completely dismiss musically as well. And that's where these conversations get really dicey, right? How do you separate the artist and their intentions from this music? Because those politics aren't in the music, it's in the person. So what do you do with the art of some deplorable human being?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you should bring that, because a friend of mine actually bought me a Burzum on LP when they had a reissue of the second record, and he gave it to me. And I was like, thank you. I mean, I'm definitely going to keep this, because now like I have it and it's like too cool to like put away. But I don't know. I don't think you knew what you got me, right? And he's like, no. And I go do a little research. And then he was like, wrote back like, oh my God. And here's like a way of being. This is kind of a vulnerable version of the question, maybe a arguably dangerously naive version, which is that I have to acknowledge that not the main tone by any means, but part of my enjoyment of certain kinds of metal is that I'm in proximity to something that I feel is authentically bad or evil, to use like a charged term that I don't really mean, but like something that's poison or toxic, whatever the words you're saying, that it's not just a pose. If it was all just a pose, it's fun. It could be fun, but I'm not that interested in it. So like Venom, I love Venom. They're great, but it's easy because they were fucking around. They were really more punk rockers anyway. Whatever. So they'll throw a little Satan in there. No problem. It sounds ugly. I love it. But the fact that some of it out there and you're not really sure what it is, and that's part of the game, is authentic, whatever that means, whether authentically satanic or in this case authentically right wing, that there's something about that that's part of the pleasure of the music, even at the same time in which I find it as a politics reprehensible. And I don't know what to do with that. I feel that, when people talk about guilty pleasures with music, it's mostly it's something that's not, there's no reason to have guilt about it all because nobody really cares. Oh, I love, Donnie and Marie. And you're like, yeah, whatever. I love Kansas, whatever. Sure. That's a guilty pleasure because I guess it's cheesy, but there's so much recuperation of cheesy music. Well, it's like, I actually have a real guilty pleasure, which is that Burzum record. I mean, I don't know what to do with that. Yeah. But I think there's something in that attitude that's not just, I don't know, that's not just sort of the dangers of not, the kind of delectable dangers of nihilism or evil or something, that is actually can be a portal to understanding something, to understanding a world that has values that you also totally reject, but has values. It's not just a gesture, an empty gesture, and that's partly what you were talking about the way in which National Socialist black metal is not just nihilist, because they have values. And this is a question I ask, now I'm curious how you say it. I'm sorry, I kind of, this is a very inspiring conversation, is that I'm not sure anymore whether I prefer people who essentially don't really have values, that are just sort of riding along the postmodern, multicultural, consumer hedonist with a little bit of environmentalism worldview without actually really engaging values, who are essentially kind of hedonic nihilists, even if they're not really thinking that way. And there's a lot of people like that, or people who really have values that I don't accept. And I don't even know anymore which of those is helping. I can't tell anymore. I mean, it's so confusing for me in terms of how values motivate action, and so you get, these questions come up when you start dealing with this kind of material. Like, geez, these people, there really are values here, and yet I can even see why they might be held and why they would be appealing to people at this sort of moment in history, even as I fundamentally reject them. I'm just you got me stirred up.
No, absolutely. Well, I think this crosses over into, for me, what's very important about my horror film podcast, Scary Thoughts, is so dialing way back from Nazis. Let's my co-host Chad Lott. So this is the horror podcast is a co-production. He and I politically don't align at all, and for me, I mean, we're both totally invested in horror, especially horror films. And, he went to UC Berkeley, so we've got a lot of sort of cultural intersection. But he's almost so far on the right that we have a pretty good understanding of each other. And I feel like that podcast is less about horror for me as a practice than about actually spending time with someone with whom I totally disagree on a lot of fundamentals about the world. That, again, part of this echo chamber that is so easy to just rattle around in endlessly. It's far more interesting for me to have regular conversations with someone who's totally into guns, right? But we have a sense of humor about our difference, and that's really precious to me, is being able to actually sit down with someone and disagree and not result in screaming and argument that that I have really learned to see. I wouldn't say the extreme other side in a sympathetic way, the way I have with, National Socialism, but at least in this very traditional American way. That to say the most obvious thing that's always in the news and being discussed in every op-ed, the degree to which this country is incredibly polarized at the moment is not very interesting to me. I certainly believe in what I believe in, but I'd actually rather have a conversation,
Yeah, I'm totally like you. I feel extremely alienated from our moment for that reason, is that my whole shtick since I was a young writer was about really trying to kind of empathize with where people were coming from. And once I sort of embarked on that, I realized that it's more interesting the more different you are from the people you're trying to empathize with. And so I was drawn to, I did a lot of research on conservative Christianity. I know a lot about fundamentalism. I've talked to people. I've engaged. I'm excited when the opportunity arises. It's not part of my normal daily life, but when I'm able to talk to people who are deeply religious, which tends to be the zone that I became most familiar with. I really enjoyed that, and I have a lot of these kind of diplomacy skills. I have a lot of ability to kind of be in the midst of these sort of ambiguous negotiations around where people's axioms are and whether or not that's okay and how we're going to, have a conversation or not. And there's so little of it. It's just, it's really depressing. Sometimes I think I should take this show and just devote it to talking to people on the right, because I have the capacity to do that in a lot of ways. And just to have those even if they're frustrating and sometimes dangerous, and I get hate mail from the left or whatever it is, that it still would be a better kind of contribution to just the possibility of a less polarized, and like you say, boringly polarized situation where you're like, it's just dull. So I hadn't actually realized that aspect of the Scary Thoughts things, because it's not always that overt,
right?
But you're lucky. That's a great opportunity to be able to
totally,
to work within that zone.
Totally. I think you should totally engage with that. I mean, I think to point out an obvious example, I think that's like Joe Rogan's superpower, is that he's able to have these crazy people on and just talk to them and just see what they're about without getting too hung up on difference. It's funny, something you just said reminded me of another aspect of doing all this research. How it affected me is that I remember some time ago you had mentioned that you were researching, was it Christian psych music or something like that?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And of course, when you said that, my knee-jerk internal reaction was, why why would you want to do that? That just sounds terrible. But then I probably went home and listened to Dark Funeral, which is like even further away from any sort of like personal feelings and ideology I genuinely have, you know. That was something I really realized. Like, I would never listen to Christian music, even though at core, I probably align more with Judeo-Christian values than some sort of overt Satanism, which constitutes a degree of my listening time, right? So what is it in me, and probably not just me, that is more likely to acclimate to, let's say, Satanism than to Christianity? What is that opposition that I'm trying to create in myself against the sort of what I view as like the dominant message, and somehow give a pass to this other thing that is preaching so-called evil, right? It's really seductive. I don't know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I you know, whatever. I'm always fantasizing about other projects I could do, and I fantasize about doing like an actual radio show, like terrestrial radio. I'm not that interested in podcasting music, but doing just sacred music, and then but I always imagine these marvelous juxtapositions where I take like, satanic metal songs that I really love. And I love partly because they are religious, or in this broad sense. I mean, this kind of nihilist religion, but there is a religious element there. There's devotional songs to Satan, and I love that. And then putting that and then playing a Christian tune right next to going like, yeah, actually, I can really enjoy both of these sentiments, because I'm really interested in religious affect. I'm really interested in the kind of intensity that people bring, even the sentimentality that people bring. Like a cheesy pop song, that's a cheesy secular pop song, to me isn't very interesting. But if it's a Christian, I'm almost often a little more interested, particularly if I have a sense that they're really going for it. Not the big glossy commercial stuff, but like some private press record from 1975 that's deeply sentimental. It's like it's someone's, there's an earnestness to it that's really powerful. Again, in that slightly perverse way, but it's also a way of resonating, because you start to resonate with other people's values. And even if their values are not your own, you kind of learning in a weird way about how people construct the world, and it gives you more sympathy for more kinds of people. And it's a very interesting practice. But I realize we're babbling away. I want to hear let people hear one of the tracks on your album. So
great.
We just have a short selection from Deface. I think that this is from Deface 5, and then you can check out the whole record on Bandcamp on Marc Kate's page there. So let's listen to the track. So Mark, what was the original source there for Deface 5? Are you willing to name names?
I'm not. I thought about that, and I think again, this music is a Google search away. I don't need to give publicity to these awful people and their music. But I will say just outright, I didn't pay for any of the music that I altered. I just couldn't bring myself, like your friend bought you that Burzum record, and $1 of your friend's money probably went straight into his pocket, right? I don't want to contribute to that economy, even if I am spending time immersed in that culture.
Well, and this track also, it reminds me in your other music as well. When I first heard, I think the first record I heard was Despairer.
Yeah.
And I also love a lot of early New Age music for kind of similar reasons. Again, I'm interested in all these kind of spiritual affect and how people think about religion and stuff. So I listen to a lot of New Age music. Again, I tried, I draw probably typically hipster lines between like kind of commercial cheese and more sort of authentic early golden age kind of stuff, although there's some exceptions to that as well. And I was really interested in your music because when I listened to it, I was like, look, if I don't know any of the context, if I didn't know Mark or the name of it or whatever, I would listen to it as a kind of, I wouldn't call it new age, but a kind of ambient music that is infused with sort of similar sorts of values. Although there was always a little difference there that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then talking to you about it, you have a very robust way of talking about ambient music and talking about these kind of spiritual drones or whatever, but from a very different perspective, almost a cantankerous anti-new age position. And I wanted to, I'd like to talk a little bit just about that in general, because it sort of runs through a lot of your music. It's very beautiful. It's very calming. It's kind of sobering, but it's also a little edgy and kind of in ways that are hard to put my finger on. So why this kind of music, and why sort of try to bring these other attitudes and ideas into music that superficially might sound like things you don't want it to evoke?
Right. I think it comes back to, I went to art school and was really immersed in strategies of conceptual art where the idea had primacy. And that's really how I sort of emerged as an artist before I rolled up my sleeves and started making music. And I think that's really informed almost everything I've done musically. Is the idea comes first. Almost everything I've recorded for the last 10 years maybe probably started with essay writing, just to myself, like what am I trying to do here, and then try to apply those ideas to synthesizers and timbres in particular, which is mostly why I do such droning music. Is I really like to slowly explore timbre possibilities with synthesis, trying to find new sounds, which is probably impossible at this point. I think the human ear has probably heard every sound it will ever hear. We've already crossed that threshold somehow. But at least trying to poke at the edges of new ways of evoking ideas and feelings through sound. And as far as new age is concerned, I find it super fascinating. All music has a function. Whether we want to think of it that way or not, all music is functional. And I find a lot of new age at least has the audacity to put that up front, that it is perhaps for meditation, or for maybe not the early stuff, so it wasn't so flagrant, but for meditation, for massage, for relaxation, to help induce states for your personal practices. And I really like the idea of functional music in that way, but music doesn't function for me that way. So how could I create new age music in a certain sense that isn't about spirituality? Because that's not my relationship to music. So what about a new age-ish music that is materialist, that is realist, that is not about some sort of meditation or, at its worst, escape, but is about here and now, that is meditation in and of itself. And that tends to be a little dark maybe, and I think the music comes out a little dark as a result of that.
Yeah, but it's again, it's sort of like also the conversation about timbre. if you think about timbre of the texture of sounds as being, in a way, like our metaphors for it, our sense of it are very material. Like the more you focus in terms of timbre, I believe, the more you're like really started dealing with the actual, you're literally dealing with the physics and the overtones that are constituting any given timbre. But it also has a kind of textural invitation to it. And so for me, a lot of these musics are also very material, even if they want to be directing themselves to escapist other worlds.
Yes.
And so to me, that makes a lot of sense. But it also has to do with the role of emotion in music, and what in our current situation, in a situation where we are living with nihilism, we are living with horrors in our news feed. I mean, I don't know about you, but I suspect you're like me, and is that I often have a new kind of nameless dread that I never experienced before, even though I was always a sort of dark cookie. I always went to the shadow. I was a Lovecraft reader from 10 years old and whatever. So I've always had a relationship with the nightmares and the anxiety and dread. But the quality of dread that our contemporary situation can deliver now is really quite something. And how do we navigate that? Can music and art help us move through it, not to cure it, but not to ignore it, but to give it almost more resonance, or to I don't know, it seems to be part of what we're trying to do, part of what you're trying to do too, is to work through these very real feelings in aesthetic terms that doesn't involve running away from them.
Yeah, I wish we could come up with better, newer terms to describe this moment we're having. One thing that is actually really kind of exciting to me about this discussion of New Age and all that is actually my very most recent album that just came out on the label Dragon's Eye is titled As If We Were Never Here, which is sort of a further extension of this sort of idea of paranihilism. I don't know how to call it. But that label Dragon's Eye was originally conceived long, long ago by a baker who wanted to include a flexi disc of George Winston's music to accompany his bread recipes in a book, and started a label. So I sort of get to tap into this legacy of George Winston and bread baking as I'm sort of exploring this non-New Age terrain. At least to my mind, that's how it's working.
That's great, man. George Winston. I saw him when I was a lad. He played barefoot.
Beautiful.
The best part of it was when the train passed by and he started to kind of improvise with the sounds of the train. That was about it. I went that. So and then we got just a few minutes here, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about horror. I have a friend was visiting is visiting right now. I had this conversation this morning. Is I had this kind of little insight that for so long I felt like that the most important genre for understanding the world, and particularly the kind of this rapid speed up of technology over the last decades was of course science fiction, but that doesn't really do that much for me anymore. It's like I might as well be reading a book about science and technology, or reading the business pages or whatever. It doesn't really work for me that much anymore.
Right.
Whereas horror seems like that. That horror is not just about our perennial fascination with the dead, or horror is not just some place like video games where we work off our id or something. That horror, for me, is increasingly at the sort of center of the work we need to do to stay awake to what's actually happening, to stay materialist and awake, and sort of navigate that space that we're in, not necessarily submit to it, but to not turn away. And so you're much more familiar with the discourse of horror than I have. I haven't read a lot into it. I've just read a lot of the primary sources. How do you see the role of horror and especially discourse around horror, talking about horror films, horror books, some of these philosophical positions that are embedded within it? How do you see that as a way of navigating our current moment?
I think it is a really good lens for looking at extremes. As we're in this very extreme time, having literature, film, music that is able to take these things to their utter extremes. I mean, that's what science fiction ultimately was able to do with the advent of all the science and technology, right? But I don't know that where we are in tech right now hasn't all been covered decades ago by really great science fiction writers. However, the collective dread that we all have around the world we're suddenly confronted with, that we perhaps most of us did not see coming, horror is perfect to use as a microscope for how we can cope with that, how we can fail to cope with that.
Yeah, it reminds me of we had Donna Haraway on the show about a year and a half ago, and the title of her book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene. And she uses this phrase, Cthulhu Scene, in a hilariously kind of unknowing way, because she's not aware of what she evoked with that term. And yet it was very appropriate. And I love it.
Yeah,
I mean,
we could use it anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, when people talk about the Anthropocene, in my mind, I just translate it into the Cthulhu Scene, and it all makes more sense to me. So the idea there, just in that title alone, is like, one, staying with it. You stay with it. You have dread, you stay with the dread. You have horror, you stay with the horror. You are aghast at the monstrosity of it. You stay with that. You don't become inured to it. You don't just fall into the patterns of distraction that consumer capitalism is laying for us at every moment. You as much as you can, you try to stay with it. And it's like, well, it's grim, or what? How are you going to still you got to find joy somewhere? Yeah, that'll still happen. You can still, and you have fun, and you find joy in the trouble. And then there's this idea of making kin, of connecting, of we're still building affective connections with people. It's not just like this sort of solitary, alienation. And that's something I disagree with a lot of the people who are more into nihilism or pessimism, is they seem very lonely in a way. And I'm like, I'm not that I mean, I have a lot of friends, and I'm friends with animals. I'm friends with trees. I'm still kind of a hippie that way. But I'm not. It's not that we're not in this Cthulhu dominated environment. So there's something about that cluster of ideas that it really kind of works for me as we.
Yeah, I mean, I would never tell someone not to take their meds, but there's something about our capacity for numbing ourselves to how intense the world can be. But I mean, I think I feel very similar to you. Honestly, the more time I spend with this stuff, it's rough. It's really hard to take. But at the same time, my life's great. I'm doing okay. And maybe all of this dark research is a part of that. That that my day-to-day is not as rough as these dark terrains that I'm navigating intellectually, right?
Yeah, I think that's sort of a healthy space, and it's the same kind of, again, the same kind of alchemy as the Deface record is like you're using the raw material that's right there, which includes dread, which includes the horror of other people's values and how hateful things can be, and you're like, yeah, well, that's part of the material that we got to work with. And so there's a kind of, that's what kind of I like so much about the project. It's subversive and piss-taking in one way, and sarcastic in one way, but in another way, it's actually really kind of beautiful and earn it. It's got a real authentic. I hate the word authenticity, but it's you're not just being snarky.
Right. No, thanks. I mean, the way I kind of think about it is that if you are a neat freak, if you are really obsessed with cleanliness, you spend a lot of time on your hands and knees scrubbing filth, right? If you want a clean house, you have to put on rubber gloves and get close to the toilet. And I mean, unless you're rich and can hire someone, and then my metaphor falls apart. But at least in terms of how my life goes, if I want a clean house, I gotta look at the filth.
Well, that's good, man. I think we'll leave it there. Once again, we've been talking to Marc Kate about his album Deface and his podcast Scary Thoughts and Why We Listen. And you can find out more on markkate.com, I believe.
Yes.
So, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. This was a great conversation.
Thank you. I'm such a fan of your podcast. It was great to be on.
Excellent. All right, folks. Until next week, keep your mind open.